Our guest tonight's Peter Lavenda. But before I get back to Peter, follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Are you watching what's going on in Twitter right now? In the feed, if it's good, I'll read it on the air. And did you see the tweet that Seth just posted? You're gonna trip out, and so is Peter right after this short break when I read this tweet from Seth. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. This is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, on this Saturday night, the 100th anniversary of Fatima. And the next hour, we will be taking your calls with our guest, Peter Lavenda. And I wanted to read this tweet. Check this out, Peter. And this is what's beautiful about social media and Coast to Coast and the Coast audience and being interactive with the audience. Now, just check this out. Seth writes in his tweet, he said, this year, October 13th falls on a Friday. I didn't know that. Did you, Peter? And how, here it is, 6 months from today, October 13th is on a Friday. Big things coming? What do you think?
Well, yeah. I mean, look at what we're in the midst of right now. I mean, today is the 100th anniversary.
Right.
Of the first Fatima vision, but October 13th will be the 100th anniversary of the last Fatima vision.
And it's on a Friday.
And it's on Friday, which is the Templar Day, right?
Yes.
The 13th in October. That is the day the Templars were suppressed. So going by the Church's own ideas about how these things work, they've got to be really thinking about this seriously and thinking that October 13th this year is especially significant. Just as Pope Francis, canonized 2 saints today.
Right.
Now 6 months from now, it's another 6 sightings, let's say, from now. And October is going to be a culmination of something. What is different now than in 1917 is that Russia actually is no longer the Soviet Union. It worked, right? So Russia did suddenly fall apart as far as the communism was concerned. The Russian Orthodox Church came back, blazing. They're now extremely powerful. They've opened up many new churches throughout the former Soviet Union. And the head of the Russian Orthodox Church is in discussions with the Pope to try to find a way if they can somehow bring their churches back together again. They've been split apart for 1,000 years. So whatever Fatima wanted, whatever was the goal, the destruction of communism in Russia, it's already happened. And now for the 100th anniversary, what does that mean? What does that portend, right? There's so much Russia in the news these days, What is the significance of all of that? So, yeah, I'm thinking that, we're talking about a Templar, date of significance to the Knights Templar. So the Knights Templar were Crusaders. They fought against the Muslims in the Middle East, right? They were trying to take back the Holy Land. They were trying to take back Jerusalem, which they did for a while, and they lost it again. But during that process of fighting against Islam as crusaders, which is what we're all talking about these days all the time anyway, they also became the people who really started the modern banking system as well.
It's beyond coincidence. And not only these dates on the 13th, the church has been marking these down over the years, right? I mean, just things have happened. Of course, we had the attempt on the life of Pope John Paul II, and that was May 13th, 81. And then a year later, of course, he visits Fatima. But on the very day of the first apparition in 1917, again on May 13th, Pope Pius XII had been ordained a bishop and later would become the Pope in 1939. And then you have, of course, Pope Paul VI became the first pope to visit Fatima to celebrate the 50th anniversary on May 13th back in 1967. These are key dates that happen over and over again for the church.
And Pope Pius XII, as you mentioned him, yes, he was consecrated a bishop on that exact day, May 13th, 1917. And he became the pope that was the most outspoken for the time against Russia, against the Soviet Union, and against communism, right? So much so that he actually collaborated to a certain extent with the Third Reich, particularly after the war, helping them get papers and false documents to get out of the way of, the Allied dragnets that were taking place throughout Europe. So the idea was we'll join with these hideous forces because they're anti-communist and they're not atheist, right? The Russians were atheists. They were, horrible. They were trying to destroy the church throughout Russia, which they pretty much did. And so now we're going to throw in our lot with the Nazis and, the Italian fascists and, Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal, and all of these guys, because they're religious, right? Perón, was Catholic in Argentina, and he's bringing in the Nazis as well. So you have a geopolitic that you have to look at when you look at Fatima. You just can't take it out of its environment, It's part and parcel of a major global, of the history of the 20th century. I mean, it's right there. The popes who were the foremost fighting against communism, including John Paul II, the Polish Pope, the guy who was very outspoken against the Soviet Union, very outspoken against communism, is the guy who gets shot on May 13th, 1981, by a Turkish assassin who claimed he was working for the Russians. So once again, you have the Russia-Turkey, combination. And here's a guy who was working for the Grey Wolves. He was part of this cult of guerrillas, a guerrilla operation in Turkey, which was also part of the counter-guerrilla, which was part of Operation Gladio and the whole stay behind thing, which a lot of your listeners are familiar with. So there's this idea that this is all back, connected to CIA stuff and all kinds of other weird stuff going on. So the Catholic Church, the anti-communism, the sort of flirtation with fascism and Nazism, all of this is all part of what was happening and it was born really at Fatima. Fatima kind of crystallized the whole message when the Virgin Mother herself comes down and says, look out for Russia. You got to do something about Russia. You got to do it now. It's May of 1917, Go and do something about Russia. And she's telling this to three little illiterate children in Portugal.
Now, and what's
saying it to the President of the United States or the Pope directly. She's talking to three kids who are herding sheep, for crying out loud, in Portugal, and they don't know what Russia is. They think it's the name of a local girl.
And how did it for you? Because you went to Catholic school, right?
Oh, yeah.
You went through that doctrine. I'm not laughing at.
The big house, yes.
I'm not laughing at Catholic schools. I'm laughing at the reputation and the fact that you did actually go through this and have to learn about Fatima. And how did that conflict with what you were taught directly in Catholic school to the facts as they started to unveil themselves in front of you?
Well, I went to Catholic school. This may come as a shock to your listeners. I went to Catholic school in the 1950s. And the 1950s was Cold War territory, right? So we had the air raid sirens and, ducking under our desks and doing all these silly things because at any moment the Russians were going to bomb us, and that would be the end of it. So Fatima was then, in the 1950s, wound up and bound up tightly with this idea because we prayed to Fatima for the salvation of Russia, for the consecration of those communists over there in Moscow. So, we saw the image was three little kids praying to the Virgin Mother. We didn't know the political context naturally. We didn't know what was going on in Portugal in 17. But all we knew was these three girls praying to the Virgin Mother, and the Virgin Mother was going to rescue Russia from communism, and we were all supposed to be on board with that. Fatima was presented to us as a fait accompli. I mean, this was something, we were not waiting for the canonization of the three children, right? We were not waiting for any of this. Fatima, we had novenas, we had, holy cards made with Fatima, we had little medals made with Fatima. Fatima was a major propaganda effort by the church, and it was focused on Russia like no other, Catholic ritual or Catholic doctrine was. Everything else, you had St. Anthony, and you had, all the other saints. You prayed for, lost causes to St. Jude, all these things you had. But Fatima was about Russia. Fatima was about the Cold War, That much we got, that much we understood when I was a kid growing up at that time. And that's when I went to Catholic schools in the 50s, right? So this was, this is the message that we got. And now that I look back on it, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's perfectly consistent with all the research I've done since then.
Lisa just tweeted out she wanted some clarification here about how old Francisco and Jacinta were when they died. They were 9. Francisco was 9 at the time in 1917. She was 7. They died in 1919 and 1920, respectively. Francisco died first in 1919. She died in 1920, apparently victims of the worldwide influenza epidemic.
Right.
And of course, Lucia, she was 10 during the apparitions, and she died as a nun at the age of 97 in 2005. Which again, I put that spin on it, Peter, for everybody to realize that this is a modern event. This isn't ancient history. This is today.
Yes. There are photographs of photographs of Sister Lucia standing next to John Paul II, for instance. He visited her after he had been shot. So I mean, there's, this was going on, and he was shot by, as I say, this young Turkish guy, Mehmet Ali Aksa. So he goes and forgives him and pardons the guy who shot him. He felt compelled to do this because it happened on Fatima Day. This was like a sign from God that something was going on. And since he was such an outspoken opponent of the Soviet Union, he feels that, the Lady of Fatima protected him because he was helping to fulfill that prophecy and fulfill that command of the Fatima visions to go and fight against Russia and to work for the downfall of the Soviet Union. So he took this all very personally. He believed it 100%. I don't find any indication that John Paul II had any second thoughts or misgivings about this. He thought his life was spared because of what he had been doing against Russia.
Now, when Lucia met with the Pope, did she meet with Pope Pius XII?
Well, I don't remember if she met Pope Pius or not.
Well, we do know that she had met the Pope and exposed the secrets, the 3 secrets. But
right.
My question is, did the Pope go from the Vatican to where she was, or did she go to the Pope?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the Pope would have done that.
Right.
Quite frankly, I don't think so. Pius XII, I don't think he would have. I mean, he took it all very seriously, but I don't think he went and visited the nun at her convent. That would have made some spectacular news if he had.
Right. So she has a sit down and she exposes the secrets. She wrote them out for the Pope, right?
Yeah. Eventually, she did, of course, learn to read and write. I mean, she got a very good education in the church, and she did write them out. But remember, she's writing them out now years later.
Right.
So that's one aspect. And she's writing them in this flowery language that no way, she was speaking when she had the visions. So she's writing it in sort of theological terms. She's using a lot of words and a lot of vocabulary she would never have had back at the time of the visions. That's what makes it all seem a little mysterious, as to where she got some of the phraseology that she used. Even shortly after the visions, she was being quoted as saying things in such a way that only makes sense if she had been a priest or if she had been, a nun or a lay person with a lot of experience in the church, which she did not have. And that's why we kind of think that the message was massaged a little bit by the church before it actually went out and became public. I don't believe that she initially, I think it's true from her conversations in the early days, I don't think she understood that the person that she saw was supposed to be the Virgin Mother. Right, she just didn't know. It was a beautiful lady dressed in white,
right, with
gold trim, I think, as she said it. And the first visitation was of a man, was of an angel of some kind, a messenger who back in 1916, and they had very confused, reactions to all of this. So I don't know if these secrets that she wrote down are word for word what she was told at the time in 1917. I have my doubts about it.
With the 3 secrets, with the first one representing a description of hell, why would that be considered a secret? And do you think that there was something else about that first secret that maybe that we're not being told? Because it seems like it's pretty benign for something to be called a secret.
Yeah, I think what happened was everything was kept secret by the church anyway. I don't think the kids were really encouraged to go in front of crowds of people and say what they saw. And so whatever they had, whatever visions they had were considered secret because the church itself was keeping these things close to its vest, right, until they could figure out what to do with it. So when she had this vision, she had this horrible vision of hell, of all these horrible things happening, and only the Virgin Mother is there to save you from these things. I think that the information was massaged, like I say, by the church in certain ways. So I think they kept that as secrets. I mean, it shouldn't be a secret. It's 1917. All of Europe was in turmoil.
Right.
Hell was right around the corner.
That's right.
Wherever you lived. So, yeah, you're right. I think that it seems like, a secret is the wrong word to use, but that's what they call them.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second secret, as we head into this break, to be clear, when we come back, we're going to start to address the supernatural or the possible UFO connection to this. But that a warning of Russia would bring calamity to the world if they didn't convert, right?
Right.
Well, how could these kids who were uneducated know about the religious aspects of Russia at that time, the Russian Revolution, the world events going on with World War II, when these are kids that were herding sheep in the mountains? Does that add something to the story where they were told this information and it was legit?
But why them? Why talk to three kids about Russia when they'd never heard of the country?
Right.
And they thought it was the name of a girl.
Right.
In another village. Why them? What is the mechanism behind this process? How does that work? We always say, why don't the UFOs land on the White House lawn, right?
Right.
Here we have the Virgin Mother landing on a small village in the middle of Portugal and talking to three little kids who can't read or write.
And that must raise an eyebrow, right? Not only for the church, but for you as a researcher, where you step back and go, well, it's too crazy to be not based on something where there has to be some truth here. It has to be accurate.
Well, there might have been a method to the madness because we're talking about it 100 years later.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And I got to tell you, this October 13th, this 100-year, the way that the world is going right now, Peter, things feel a little bit strange to everybody. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to realize that the world is a pretty crazy place right now. And here we are, the 100th anniversary of Fatima, and everything is starting to click off in a row. And now we have Friday the 13th, this October. Pretty crazy. The 100th anniversary of October 13th will be on a Friday this year. I got to say, how does that make you feel as we lead into this break?
Well, we're still talking about Turkey and Russia, aren't we?
It's amazing. And that's exactly what we're talking about tonight. Our guest, Peter Levenda. This is Coast to Coast AM. Your phone calls are next. We'll be right back. You got to love the bumper music tonight, right? Have you ever wanted to see George Norrie live, by the way? You ever want to see him interview his guests in person? Well, now you can. That's because on Saturday, July 29th, 2017, from 5 to 8 p.m., he's going to be doing it on stage at the Everett Theater in Everett, Washington. That's right. It's radio to stage. Watch George interview some of today's brightest experts in the world of ufology, paranormal, conspiracy, all things unexplained. He's going to have Robert Felix, Sonia Grace, Mike Barra, and John Hogue. Guests that you've heard so many times here on Coast to Coast, but you'll be able to experience this in person and live. Tickets and info over in the George Norrie events section at coasttocoastam.com. Check it out and go check out George up in Everett, Washington. Well, it all began on May 13th, 1917. The visions continued through October 13th, 1917. Today is the 100th anniversary of that event, and that event was Fatima. Our guest is Peter Levenda. More with Peter, your phone calls, and we're going to ride this thing out tonight for the 100th anniversary of the story. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. This is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. Our guest tonight is Peter Levenda. We're talking about the 100th anniversary of Fatima. And, Peter, we have to talk about the UFO side of this. I mean, it is a classic description of things that have been witnessed for centuries. Now, as you started to jump into this, how does that start to fit into the Fatima story?
Well, I mean, it does kind of, because it's consistent with what we've seen since then, how UFO sightings are handled and how the message is often manipulated by whoever finds themselves in charge of the situation. For instance, in the case of Fatima, the church found itself in charge of it. It was framed in religious terms. If it was a UFO sighting, if the whole incident from 1916 through all the sightings of 1917 could be classed as, the UFO phenomenon in some way, shape, or form, if that's really what it was, then it gives us a way of reinterpreting what's happened since then. If we look at what happened from 1947 on, let's say, in general terms, how the church was no longer in charge of that information and interpreting it for us and telling us what the message was and weaponizing that experience, as it looks like Fatima was to a certain extent.
Right.
We can see that the government and the military, perhaps, or intelligence agencies, or whatever the powers that be were in each specific case, were using the UFO experience for their own ends. So you could take a Fatima-type experience and put it in New Mexico in 47, as an example, or in Seattle in the same year, or in Washington in 1952, and instead of giving it a religious interpretation, now you're giving it a kind of military interpretation. Maybe it's secret weapons, right? It's mysterious things that have been flying over us from Russia or from China or somewhere.
Right.
Or there's nothing to see there. The scientists take over, and then they change the message. Well, it's swamp gas, or it's, Operation Mogul, or it's a weather balloon. So you still have the experiences. They're still there. And depending upon who gets to them first, that's how they're given to the public. That's how they're presented. So if the church gets in there first, they can interpret this thing in a religious context. That was easy to do in Portugal when the struggle between the church and state was so enormous. There was so much tension involved. In this country, perhaps in the last 50 years, it may be more difficult to portray these things in religious terms. People are a lot more cynical. Plus, there was the Cold War. We were in conflict with the Soviet Union. So there's all these other issues that were coming up. Secrecy was very important. Some of the stuff might have been secret weapons, in some of the sightings. Other sightings, more like Fatima. So how do we control the message, right? For us, it was Cold War. It was military. It was a different kind of an environment than Portugal in 1917. So we're interpreting all these things in a different way. And I think Fatima gave everybody an idea, Here's a sighting. And there were other sightings around the world, not just in that year, but in years previous and years after. So here's a sighting, and the church got to it first, and they turned it into this. I'm not saying it was or wasn't, but I'm saying look at it from a logistical point of view. What can we do? Is this a good template for us in the future? Because we can use these sightings and call them anything we want to. We can project onto them whatever it is we need at that moment.
And what's interesting,
that's the danger. That's the danger to truth in general, is that this can be done and probably has been done.
And what's interesting is you are writing about just this right now with Tom and your new book, In Secret Machines, Gods, Volume 1 of God's Man in War. And the religious aspect when it comes to what the UFO situation or relationship is, that there is a direct religious aspect to all of it. And here we have Fatima, and we have that in spades, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, it's QED, This is, just like you said, we have it in spades. The religious aspect to it has been with us since the very beginning, since I think the very first contact, whenever that was, or the very first contact just before recorded history began. I think we We have this way of interpreting the phenomenon that way. And I think that's a key to this. It's not a mistake, and it's not a question of being, superstitious or being stupid or being, uneducated or unscientific. I think it's quite deliberate. I mean, what it is a mechanism for activating this kind of thing in our minds. I'm having a hard time explaining what I mean without referencing the book specifically, but in the book we talk about religious experiences around the world and reinterpreting them from the point of view of contact with this phenomenon, with this Fatima phenomenon, you might call it. And how is that handled? How do we interpret it? How do we react to it? And we react to it by looking up. We react to it by trying to form organizations and scientific communities and religious communities, all with the attention focused on space, focused on getting off planet maybe, focused on contact with something from outer space, something from off planet. There's this off planet focus with all of this, and we mistakenly sometimes think, well, these are religious superstitions that people had. That's not true, I don't believe. I think that there's something more to it because the whole world is on that page. It's not like cultural differences, like in this part of the world they think it's religious, and in that part of the world they think it's something else. No, everybody thought it was religious. Everybody framed contact in religious terms.
That's right.
The closest we had to understanding psychology and psychiatry and science and chemistry and biology and all the rest of it, quantum consciousness, all these things, the closest we could come to it was framing it in these terms which we now call religious, but which may not have been originally religious.
If 2,000 years ago, Peter, we had an event that was documented about the sun spinning, right? The sun, not a craft, but the sun spinning and zigzagging down towards Earth and then taking back off, we would look at that in a number of different ways, that they saw this. They said they didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't understand. But this was 1917.
Right.
And when you are describing the sun spinning and zigzagging towards Earth, we're talking about a real event that needs to be explained, unless it was supernatural or it was something off planet.
Right.
Really quick, I don't want to cut you off. I want to try to get some phone calls in. You agreed with me that you were going to man the phones with me tonight, so
yes.
Let's start to kick this off. Let's go west of the Rockies with Star right here in Southern California. Star, you're up first on Coast to Coast.
Okay, blessings to both of you. I was in the military during 1968 and 1970 in the Army. I acquired a top-secret clearance in the field of cryptology. And when I left the United States and to do my tour of duty in South Korea, by the grace of God, I became a chaplain's assistant. And while I was there, I'm on my knees every day in this particular church right next to the DMZ. When I finished my tour of duty in October of 1970, I had a visitation from the Blessed Virgin Mary. I was sleeping in my bed, and I could hear a faint voice of a woman speaking to me. I opened up my eyes, and there was the Blessed Virgin Mary. She was dressed in a beautiful, beautiful blue gown, and she had a soft blue veil across her face, and I could see her face lit up behind this beautiful blue veil on her face. She looked about 15 or 16 years old. When she gave birth to the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ, she was 15 years old. And she was floating about a foot off the ground. She prepared me for 20 years later for the first visitation that I had from the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ, which was in 1990 in Los Angeles. In between that time, this is the predictions that she gave me to give to the earth. Number one, God sent the ball of redemption against the earth in 1995 it will appear on September the 23rd this year, called Planet X, or Nibiru, named by the Sumerians. Very dangerous time for the earth. She also said that God's going to send a plague to take the children off the earth before the nuclear conflagration. She said in the first 3 hours of the nuclear conflagration on the earth, 75% of all life will be lost. Mexico, United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia. She also told me that a confrontation will take place with the United States, Japan, and South Korea against North Korea, and she showed me a 4-stage black nuclear missile fired by Kim Jong-un in North Korea, striking downtown Los Angeles, leaving a crater 10 miles in circumference with total destruction. It looked like the landscape of the moon. And then she showed me that in the Middle East, the United States, Israel, and Turkey will go to war with Russia, Syria, and Iran, and Israel will use the nuclear weapons given to them by the United States, and it's going to completely and totally destroy the Middle East. And in June 2015, Elijah the prophet told the oldest rabbi in Israel that Israel was about to be invaded and destroyed. And when that nuclear conflagration takes place in the Middle East, that is when Jesus Christ is going to return. And it's interesting, Jimmy Church, that you mentioned a UFO association with the appearance of the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1917 in the visitation that I had from Jesus Christ. He showed me hell. He showed me judgment upon the earth. And I was aboard a starship, and I saw and met St. Matthews that was coming to the earth in 1990 to be the last prophet, and Jesus Christ turned St. Matthews away, and he said, Matthews, go back. I'm not sending the last prophet to the earth. We are in a very, very dangerous time. And Jimmy Church, the euphemism I use is star, but my name is Suleiman Edmondson. I want all of your listeners to go to google.com.
Don't do it. Don't. Yeah, no addresses. Can't do that. Okay. Sorry about that, Star, but very interesting. I'm going to mention this to Peter really quick. It's easy today, Peter, with all the news and the way that things are breaking and to interpret things, to tie right back into some of these prophecies from Fatima or things that were talked about in the Bible and the New and the Old Testament, and looking at today where some of this stuff may feel like it's coming to pass. And I don't want to be a fearmonger, but it's kind of easy to start to look into this, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, when the three children had their visions in Fatima, I mean, it was all doom and gloom, wasn't it? I mean, the Virgin Mother didn't go and say, don't worry about it, next year will be fine. I mean, they never do for some reason. It's always, dire predictions that are going to come to pass. And there's never anything that you can do about it. I mean, in the case of Fatima, they told the children to tell the world to repent, and go back to church and all of that. That's the only way you're going to avoid the worst of it. But it's still going to come.
Right.
There's still going to be the bloodshed and the conflagrations and all the rest of it. And the best you can hope for is to pray and to ask for forgiveness, and that's it.
It's so easy, and I can understand the concern. I really can, because I have the same nervousness, inside of myself. Yeah. But I just try to keep confidence and know that everything is going to, in the end, ultimately, just be okay. I think we're all adults here. Believe it or not, I think that we're starting to grow up. Yeah, right. Let's go east of the Rockies. Tim in Peoria, Illinois. You're up next, Tim.
Okay, hello. I don't want to change the subject, but I want to talk about stigmata for a minute. My late father was in World War II, visited Teresa Neumann. I don't know if you've ever heard of her or have read up on her, but I found a letter that he had wrote he was also in the military, a chaplain's aide like the last guy. And they went to visit her and got to go up in a room during one of her visions, her ecstasies. And it's very interesting. I don't know if you could ever do a program on her or why. I was just curious of how come nobody ever talks about her. Or
well, Tim, you bring up a really good point, and I want to thank you for that. Peter, there were a few things that were pretty trendy over the years, and certainly at the turn of the century, and stigmata and other photographic evidence of some of these things that were going on with people that were having visions and things were happening to them. It's kind of gone away, right? Why do you think that is?
Well, it might have been. I think that the most famous carrier of this message was Padre Pio, right? I don't know if you remember him.
Of course.
I grew up with that in the church, and this was this Italian priest who constantly, had stigmata all the time. I mean, it was photographed, it was videotaped, and all of it.
Right.
And the stigmata, in this case, technically speaking, is the wounds of Christ, right? What you're doing is you're meditating so hard, you're identifying so strongly with the sufferings of Jesus that the holes in the hands and the feet suddenly you start bleeding as if you're on the cross. And there's also the spear in the chest and the side. So you'll bleed from different parts of the body, and this is supposed to be an example of your identification through suffering with the image of Jesus. I think Padre Pio died a number of years ago, and I think sort of that concentration on this sort of just dropped off. People just didn't talk about it as much anymore. There was a famous movie, of course, with what's her name, Arquette.
Yes.
Stigmata. I mean, so that kind of brought back the consciousness of it for a while. But I think since then there really hasn't been, much talking about it. It's a paranormal experience, to be sure. I mean, you could call it psychosomatic or whatever you want, but it's pretty astonishing when you see it. And I've only seen it in, like I say, videotape and in photographs.
Now, I wanted to ask you really quick. Oh man, I've got 30 seconds before the break, so I'm going to quickly. If Fatima happened here and it was an ET event, let's say it was a UFO event, a close encounter, does that mean that religion would be the same on other planets, other solar systems, other galaxies? The same thing is going on there?
Wow.
I mean, think about that for a second, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to explore. We need to go deeper into that, and we've got a lot of calls coming in. But I've often wondered, Peter, if that is the case, and the universe was created, right, and God created the universe, then do other planets and ET and civilizations have their own Jesus? They would have to, right? Well, let's talk about it. This is Coast to Coast AM. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Peter Levenda, on the 100th anniversary of Fatima. We'll be right back.